This is UC Davis Live. I'm Satirius Johnson. 6 people died in the April 3rd shooting in Sacramento, and the spring holiday weekend saw at least 4 mass shootings across the country. During the pandemic, gun sales surged, while the White House recently announced a crackdown on untraceable ghost guns. What are the trends in gun violence, and what are we learning about its causes, consequences, and prevention? UC Davis is one of just a few research centers in the country dedicated to researching the impacts of gun violence. And joining us today are 2 experts from the UC Davis Violence Prevention Research Program. Garen Wintemute is a practicing emergency medicine physician and a pioneer in the field of injury epidemiology and the prevention of firearm violence. His work helped create the public health approach to violence prevention. Dr. Wintemute is director of the UC Davis Violence Prevention Research Program and also directs the University of California Firearm Violence Research Center. And Amy Barnhorst is the vice chair for community mental health at the UC Davis Department of Psychiatry, associate professor in the Department of Emergency Medicine, and director of the Bullet Points Project, a state-funded effort to develop a firearm violence prevention curriculum for healthcare providers. Dr. Barnhorst is a nationally recognized expert on firearms law and mental illness. Welcome to you both.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
As a reminder, if you're watching us live, we are taking your questions. Just leave them in the comments section and we'll work in as many as we can. Events like the April 3rd shooting are shocking and high profile, but what did the data tell us about trends in gun violence? Garen, let's start with you.
Sure. First off, it's important to remember that public mass shootings account for only about 1% of deaths from firearm violence. And our conversation is about the other 99% as well. And to look at them, from 2019 to 2020, we saw an increase in firearm homicide greater than we have seen in 100 years of record keeping. And the records do not go further back than that. It's an unprecedented increase year over year, and a further 15% increase from 2020 to 2021, such that as we came into 2022, rates of firearm homicide across the United States were 45% higher on average than they were in 2019.
So you're saying even though these mass shootings are, tragic and high profile, you're saying they are really just the tip of the iceberg as far as this problem goes?
I would use a different metaphor, but we'll stick with this one. There is no part of the iceberg that we do not pay attention to. But I think it is really important to recognize that mass shootings capture the public's attention in part precisely because they are so uncommon.
Mm-hmm. Now, firearm sales surged in the first months of the pandemic. What do you think was behind that, and what effect did it have on the rates of gun violence?
I'll be brief in answering that question. We also saw an absolutely unprecedented increase in firearm purchasing that began in January 2020 and only came to an end at the end of 2021, and now seems to be occurring again in the spring of 2022. The initial driver, I think, was the advent of the pandemic and then its appearance, the prospect of social unrest. As we moved into 2020, rates of violence began increasing and people buy in response to rates of violence. 2020 was a federal election year, and federal election years always stimulate gun purchases, in part because of concern about changes in gun policy. This time, the gun control candidate won, which drove purchases up further. We saw the advent of political violence culminating in an assault on the Capitol incited by the sitting president, all of which is driving not just gun purchasing, but an increased interest in and support for political violence in the United States. On the relationship, early in 2020, there was a very clear relationship at the state level between the size of the increase in purchasing and the size of the subsequent increase in violence. As the year went on and other factors that I've listed came into play, that clear signal attributed to purchasing alone was lost, except for domestic violence.
Mm-hmm. Amy, what are you seeing from the mental health standpoint?
Well, interestingly, and I'll just add to something that Garen said early on, which was that, mass shootings are this tiny fraction of firearm deaths. And Most firearm homicides are not mass shootings, but the majority of firearm deaths are actually suicides, not homicides. So when he talks about the iceberg, we think about those two. One of the things that we expected to see during the pandemic was with people's increased isolation, concern about illness, and just generalized mental health decline, we thought we would see an uptick in suicides, and particularly firearm suicides, given the increase in purchasing. And strangely enough, the suicide rate, which has been rising in the US for about 17 years, took a small dip during the initial year of the pandemic. So we haven't seen that borne out, although there have been specific populations where there has been a rise in both suicides and firearm suicides. And that's mostly young adult males of color is the most specific group.
Has that surge in gun buying subsided? I guess you basically said, I don't know if the data ended where, your research ended at that range, that date range that you gave, but has the gun buying subsided for the most part, or has it basically kept up pace?
We follow these data monthly, and tax dollars at work. Data for a given month are typically available nationwide on the second working day of the following month. So what we saw was a more than 50% increase in purchasing over expected levels through 2020 and 2021. It came to an end at the end of 2021, but the data for March of this year show an increase perhaps beginning again. We're just going to have to wait and see.
Eric, who's watching on YouTube, asks, he says, I use uniform crime reporting to trace gun violence. Where do you draw your data from?
An array of sources. We use, for the folks listening, Uniform Crime Reports is a mechanism set up by the FBI, law enforcement agencies on a voluntary basis, report crime statistics. We use UCR all the time. We also use criminal history records. We use local agency reports, but we also rely on UCR. I'll stop there.
Okay. And as a reminder, if you're watching us live, we are taking your questions. Just leave them in the comment section, and we'll work in as many as we can. So what areas is the Violence Prevention Research Program focused on, and how can research contribute?
We're going to split the answer to this. I will talk a little bit about research and ask Amy to talk about bullet points, which is a huge part of what we do. Our research focuses on the causes and the consequences and the prevention of firearm violence. We've come to understand that, particularly in California, there are limits to what can be done in preventing firearm violence if we just focus on firearms. So our scope is actually quite broad. We are looking at risk factors for violent crime among people who purchase firearms legally. We are mapping criminal gun markets. We are developing new methods of threat assessment. We are assessing the effectiveness of policies like gun violence restraining orders and requirements that all purchases of firearms come with background checks, and much more, but I'm going to stop there.
Okay. Amy?
And to add to what Garen said, there's so many pieces of firearm violence and violence in general. It's not just the firearms. There's so many upstream factors that contribute, starting from people's communities and neighborhoods, their childhoods, the opportunities they have available to them, the experiences they have as youths and adolescents. And all of those things roll into their risk of violence in the future. So that's part of the research as well, is just looking at not just firearms, but the other contributing factors. And then part of what I do with the Bullet Points Project and some other work is to take some of the great research done by the people at the center and bring it out into the world in various ways. And so one of the projects that we've done is develop this whole curriculum for healthcare providers to be able to understand how firearm violence affects their patients, which of their patients might be at risk, both of perpetrating or being victimized by it. What are the ways they can identify that risk and have conversations about guns in the home to keep families and patients safe? So we have a lot of interest from healthcare providers, including nurses, social workers, psychologists, physicians all across the nation who want to be more involved in preventing firearm violence, but don't quite know how.
What are some of those factors, those other factors?
So, there's certain clinical situations for medical providers where a firearm in the mix can really increase the level of dangerousness, either for firearm suicide or for homicide in the home, or even for unintentional injury. So anybody who's living in the home with a child should at least have a discussion about safe storage, the same way that physicians talk to their patients about things like, the temperature of the water heater, or is the car seat installed properly? Is your kid wearing a bike helmet? Are you avoiding cigarette smoke within the home? These kind of like generalized health issues within the household. Folks who are living with, say, an adolescent or even an adult who suffers from depression or has other risk factors for suicide, like heavy alcohol use, a recent loss of a relationship or a job, that might be a time where, if they have firearms in the home, you want to make sure that that person doesn't have immediate access to those firearms, or depending on their level of risk, you may actually want to get the firearms out of the home temporarily, so it's not something that they can reach for in a time of crisis. Folks with dementia, as an example, can become paranoid or sometimes misinterpret who somebody is or what their intentions are. And so they may have had access to firearms their whole life, but as their cognitive status worsens, we may have to take different steps to keep them out of their hands during times of lack of clarity. So things like that of kind of helping them identify that risk, and then what is the appropriate thing to do in that particular situation. We have a great website for anybody who's interested, the bulletpointsproject.org.
That's great. That's great. Klaus, who's watching on Facebook, he says, increases in gun purchases reflect the increased lawful acquisition of firearms. Did the uptick in gun deaths occur from predominantly legal or illegally possessed firearms? In other words, is the slope in the gun depth curve the same as the slope for increased gun purchases?
Great question. It has several parts. I'm going to hit a couple of them, and I'm going to be brief. There was a time 30 years ago or so when the rate of gun violence and the rate of gun purchasing tracked each other up and down like this. They were very closely linked. That coupling disappeared about 15 years ago. And there are new factors in the mix. There is actually, let me bring in the second point that the questioner makes. We simply don't have good data on the frequency with which the person who commits a firearm violent crime is the legal purchaser of that firearm. We have some rough estimates that about 80% of the time, the gun is not in the hands of its original legal purchaser, but there are limits in the data which were established through it as part of an effort to prevent research from being done that make it impossible to trace even the legal ownership of that gun beyond the first purchase. So we don't have a good answer. We do know that a fair percentage, maybe 40% or so, of people who commit gun homicide are not prohibited from owning firearms at the time. But this is one of those questions for which we don't have good answers. And the absence of good answers is the result of a deliberate effort to prevent the research from being done.
Let's talk about that a little bit. So is it as part of it the prevalence, now the growing prevalence of these ghost guns, or is there something more than that going on?
Well, there are two things. The proper name for those is privately manufactured firearms, and I want to give reference to that, but we'll save some syllables, call them ghost guns. These are guns that are made completely outside any regulatory framework. They can be produced at home. They can be produced at home in large numbers, and they have no serial numbers. There's no ownership record. When they're used in a crime, their ownership cannot be traced. So in a legal sense, they come from nowhere, which is where they got the ghost guns name. That's about to be, ghost guns are about to become harder to make under a new federal rule. But separately, in the mid-1990s, there was an effort led by a congressman Jay Dickey was his name, to strip federal funding for firearm violence research. That effort was successful. For more than 20 years, there was essentially no funding. There is again now, but we've lost 20 years. It's as if we said for 20 years, let's not do research on cancer. Let's not do research on heart disease. Our economic interests might be threatened by the research, so we'll just not do the research. That's what happened with firearm violence.
Mm-hmm. And So you're saying that the correlation between those two things used to be very closely linked. Now they're not, but we don't know why they're not, or do we?
And part of the answer is that privately manufactured firearms have entered the mix. But the other part, I would agree, is that we're simply seeing that even excuse me, closely regulated firearm purchasing is not as clearly tied to crime rates as it used to be. And when it was, there was disagreement about whether crime rates were pulling gun purchases or gun purchases were driving crime rates. Which way did the causal arrow point? And the smart money, to be honest, was it pointed in both directions.
Mm-hmm. So what are some of the things you're finding that make communities more vulnerable to gun violence or more resilient?
Amy, do you want to take that one?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that makes communities vulnerable to gun violence is, and it's sort of a self-perpetuating cycle, because communities who don't have a lot of investment from the government, who have been historically marginalized and discriminated against, there's been lack of real estate investment. It's hard to get a mortgage, say, to have families invest in homes and improve areas, and then businesses don't want to come in. And this whole cycle ends up impoverishing communities, making things really hard for families, and meaning that there's not good educational opportunities, there's not public parks, there's not safe, good schools that kids can walk to with their friends and do activities at and be successful in. And then there's not economic opportunities for college, for jobs. There's high rates of unemployment. People turn to substance use, sometimes crime. And in these sorts of communities, we see more gun violence because there is a lack of alternatives. We see kids going to gangs because that's where they have support. That's where they have protection and loyalty. We see middle schoolers taking guns to school because they don't feel safe and protected by their school system or at home. And, historically, these are the communities with the higher rates of firearm violence. And that both is caused by and then perpetuates lack of investment, lack of opportunity, marginalization. And this is when Garen mentioned early on that it's not just about the firearms. There are all these other causes of violence. And it's much easier to, have one shooting and say, well, let's pass a law that would have prevented that last shooting. But that's not going to really help you for the next shooting, because everyone has very individual and specific factors. It's much harder to actually invest very early on in people's lives and in their communities and in their education and their potential. And that's really, if we could wave a magic wand and do something, that is really where we would want to make that investment, not at the last minute at passing some sort of legislation that would have stopped that particular guy from getting the gun and shooting people.
Garen, do you want to add anything?
I actually do, and thank you. I was going to not answer whatever question you asked me next. So just to quantify some of what Amy is saying, we and everybody drastically underestimate the effect, the burden that violence imposes on communities, and not only the heavily impacted communities, but obviously mostly them. Our group has an ongoing program of survey research, and we recently asked a large sample of California adults questions about, if you will, their everyday experience of violence, the day-to-day knowledge of the presence of violence or its potential. We asked, so are gunshots and shootings a problem in your neighborhood? How frequently do you drive by a sidewalk memorial where somebody has died from violence? Do you know somebody who has been shot or has shot themselves, to Amy's point about suicide? Do you know somebody who's at risk for doing violence to somebody else or to themselves? And when we looked at those 6 everyday experiences, we discovered that more than 2/3 of Californians today report having such experiences. We all have a stake in the game, and about 1 person in 6 reports 3 or more of them. So there is this high daily level awareness of violence is one of my neighbors. I don't like it, but that's how it is. And when we came to the data on sidewalk memorials and how frequently people encountered them, I looked back from the cross tabulations and thought, in these neighborhoods, it must feel like living in a cemetery. There are memorials everywhere.
Let's see. Vernal from Facebook asks, do you believe that universal background checks can help curb gun violence in our communities?
Amy, do you want me to take that one?
Sure, I'll add to it.
Okay.
Yeah, go for it.
So the evidence is mixed. We have, and other people have, published studies showing a relative lack of effect of universal background checks by themselves in lowering rates of firearm violence level, but population level rates. That work, ours included, has a flaw. To do the study, you have to assemble data from an early point in time and sort of see what happens over time to see if the policy had an effect downstream. And it's become very clear here in California and elsewhere that when these policies were first put in place, and these are basically before-after studies, the data to allow for rigorous background checks simply did not exist. So all kinds of people who should have been prohibited were not, because their prohibiting events weren't in the data. That's a problem that continues to today. The other thing that we are learning is that even with better data, it may well be that adding a permitting process to the background check process makes a big difference. I have to say the scientific conclusions are still tentative on all of this.
Amy?
I'll just add that as sort of a general principle, none of the other prohibitions matter without the background check. It's sort of the foundation, because you can say all these things are illegal, but there's no way to prevent them from happening if you don't require the people who are prohibited from being background checked. But there's also research to show that a lot of the people we prohibit are not really the people at the highest risks. So we're kind of casting these really broad nets, maybe catching some people who are at high risk of either firearm suicide or firearm violence, prohibiting a ton of people who are not particularly high risk, but mostly missing the people who are the ones who are out there perpetrating violent firearm crime and also who are at high risk of firearm suicide.
You know, there's such pushback from certain quarters against any kind of, gun control or any kind of legal regulation. Is there any sense from your research that, to your point, Amy, about all these other factors, like trying to help people early in life to not kind of, resort to violence because they have very few other opportunities? Is there any of, a solution that comes from some more social support for people, as opposed to regulating the purchase of guns as far as, results?
I know there are a lot of ongoing efforts within communities, and I think these efforts really need to be taken on by people, and they are being taken on by people who are part of those communities, who understand the community, and they're very individualized. So it's really different, between Los Angeles and Chicago. It's really different from place to place. And it really can't be a blanket approach or an outsider approach. But there are a lot of, for example, violence interruption programs where people from, neighborhoods or communities that have been highly impacted by violence are getting out there and networking with folks in the communities, trying to help provide opportunities or help people see opportunities that are there to take a different path than, getting involved in gangs or criminal activity. And there's been some really great work on this. And I know there's some ongoing research at the center about the effects of these programs as well. We have one at Davis.
So let me address the first part of your question to Amy, the pushback on gun control. Gun control is a term that we don't use very much because we think more broadly, but my point is not that, it's this. The idea that there is widespread resistance to regulating the ownership and use of firearms is actually not supported by the evidence. If you ask, for example, should people who've been convicted of violent crimes be disallowed from owning guns? If you ask, should there be background checks for all purchases? Support is very, very high, above 80%, even for firearms, well above 90% for the majority of the population that does not own firearms. Oftentimes, and I agree with the quotes here, other side, on the point that we could do a much better job enforcing the laws we have on the books. I'm going to give you an anecdote. Mass shooting in Sutherland Springs, Texas, 26 people die. The shooter purchased several firearms from a gun store in Texas. He passed a background check in order to make those purchases. He was prohibited from making those purchases. He had a domestic violence conviction while serving in the Air Force. The Air Force, although it was required to do so, did not report that conviction. Data weren't in, the conviction wasn't in the background check. The background check did not determine that he was prohibited. The retailer had no clue that he was selling a firearm to a prohibited person, and 26 people died. The Air Force alone discovered that it had not reported tens of thousands of prohibiting events. The Air Force has the best reporting record in the military, and only federal agencies like the military are required to report. For state and local law enforcement agencies, reporting of prohibiting events is voluntary. The background checks are only as good as the data on which they are run.
Eric from YouTube again is asking, how did you randomize your sample? If I search for gun violence in Davis, it's close to none, but if I conduct a survey in South Sacramento, the rates significantly increase.
Good, I'll take that one. I'm going to assume that's a question about our survey research. We work with an established survey research firm that has a panel, a continuing panel of people who have agreed to participate in survey research. The recruitment process for that panel is address driven. It is voluntary and subject to consent, but it's not a simple opt-in. The survey research firm builds a population representative panel of people for surveys, and they offer that service for a price, and we work with that panel. Because any given panel of people who participate may not exactly, results are weighted so that the reported results are in fact representative of the population. And to address an implication of the question, we don't report survey results on a very small area. We would never report survey results comparing Davis and Sacramento because, or South Sacramento, because there wouldn't be enough subjects from Davis or South Sacramento in a statewide survey. So we report at a level of aggregation that allows us to make statistically valid estimates.
Got it. Okay. I'm curious, what drew each of you to this work? Amy, why don't we start with you?
That's great, because my story kind of segues into Garen. In 2012, I believe, was the Sandy Hook shooting. And at the time, I had 2 kids in elementary school here in Sacramento, and I was working, running a crisis unit for the county. So my job was to see people who were brought in on mental health holds and evaluate them to see if they met the involuntary commitment criteria for either being dangerous to themselves or dangerous to someone else. And when the Sandy Hook shooting happened, you know, of course, a lot of the people, parents I knew, went straight to school and pulled their kids out of school. And I was at work kind of hearing all the news come in and hearing all these people say, like, well, how did the mental health system fail this guy? Why did they not detect him? Why was he not in a hospital? Why was he not treated? And, you know, I became increasingly frustrated because I am sort of that mental health system. I'm the person at the counter who the cops would have brought him to, that would have had to make that decision of, does this guy meet involuntary commitment criteria? And then secondarily, if we're able to keep him here, even if he doesn't want to be treated, how could we get him better? Like, what would we do with him? How do we treat him that would have made him not potentially violent and dangerous? And my answer to both those questions really was, I don't really know. Like, I'm not sure this is a situation where we could help, but yet that was where a lot of the blame was being put. So I was on call that weekend in working in the ER, and one of my attendings from when I was a medical student at Davis, Garen Wintemute, was also working in the ER, and I had no idea that he was one of the, you know, prominent firearm violence researchers in the nation. I butted in on a conversation he was having with somebody about the Sandy Hook shooting and the whole mental illness versus guns debate. And I said, you know, I really want to write an op-ed about this. I run a crisis unit. And Garen supported me and helped me out and said, have a draft on my desk in 2 days. We'll get it into the SAC-B. And it was published in the SAC-B. And I think people were actually really curious to have somebody with the insider perspective of the mental health system, because it was a great black box that everyone could say, well, we'll just pawn this all off on the mental health system because we don't really know what that is or how it works. So hopefully it's the fix we're all looking for. And then I sort of became the voice of, actually, it's not really the fix a lot of us are looking for. Garen. And I'll let Garen tell his story, which starts a little sooner.
I'd say my story runs longer. So I was a physician before I was a violence researcher. I'm an ER doc, and I've always been interested in intervening in the flow of events that brings people through the doors of the emergency department? Is there something we can do to prevent that? And I should mention, as an aside, it remains the case for firearm violence that the majority of people who die from gunshot wounds die where they were shot. That was true of everybody who was shot and killed in downtown Sacramento. So as a clinician, if I want to keep people from dying from gun violence, I have to keep them from getting shot in the first place. But what focused me on violence was actually time spent in Cambodia. Immediately after Pol Pot time, there was gunfire around us. We were in a refugee camp. Gunfire around us. We would hear landmines go off on the periphery of the camp and wonder if that person would make it to us or not. Spent 5 months there, never met an intact family, learned about the power of violence to reshape an entire society, and came back to the US, quit my job running an emergency department, went back to school to learn about violence and epidemiologic methods, and here we are.
Very interesting. I mean, very, very personal, convictions that have drawn both of you to this work. Before we wrap up, I was hoping to hear from each of you about if there were, say, 2 or 3 things that we can do as a society. What would you recommend we do? What steps could we take to make communities safer?
Amy, you want to go first?
Sure. Again, I'll go back to my magic wand, which is making communities better and nicer and having more opportunities for kids. So I think it's really hard once you have, adults who have lived very hard, traumatic lives and haven't had time to build the emotional resilience that you have when you have a safe space to grow up in. So investing in communities and in people and in families very young, having affordable housing, having job opportunities, not having parents who are absent because they have to work 2 jobs just to pay rent and have everybody in a small apartment by themselves and have their kid attend a failing public school that's not safe to walk to, not having neighborhood spaces for kids to play and socialize. So investing in all of the kinds of, unexciting but really important things like schools, parks, housing, education, employment, all of that stuff is violence prevention. And recognizing that it's not just the mass shootings that hit the news that are violence in our communities, it's that other 99%, as Garen said. It's not just the people in suburban neighborhoods who, once every blue moon experience a horrific mass shooting in a theater or a church or a school. It's the communities that have those sidewalk memorials on every block where somebody got caught in the crossfire of violence. A criminal activity went south and someone was killed. There was a domestic violence incident. This 99% that happens every day in some communities. And then those kids grow up with that. When you're a 6th grader and your cousin's been killed, your brother's taking a gun to school so he feels safe, you don't have time to build up the emotional resilience that then will buffer you against stressful events when you're older. So if you think about all the people who were downtown at the Sacramento mass shooting the other weekend, the ones who had the luxury and the privilege of growing up in more buffered, privileged childhood spaces with good, close families, a lack of stress, a lack of trauma and abuse, investment in their education, safe parks to play in, they're going to have more emotional resilience and psychological buffering to respond better to that shooting if they were there than the kids who already grew in a very stressful environment early on. And it's going to be those kids who then suffer the mental health consequences of witnessing that violent event and being part of it. And then they're going to go on and have further mental health issues, higher risk of substance abuse, more problems with employment and economic opportunities, and potentially even more risk of perpetrating violence themselves. So that wasn't really a list, but that was my contribution.
That was good. That was good. Garen?
I'm going to be kind of high level, but I'm going to close quite concretely. First is don't give up hope. This is something I've heard a lot. Gee, this latest terrible thing happened. I give up. No, because giving up on making change for the better in violence amounts to giving up on us and our capacity to make change. And whether it's violence or climate change or any of the other huge complicated problems that face us, I personally am simply not willing to give up on us as a species and our capacity to get better over time. Number two is be yourself the change that you hope to see. I often get queries, geez, is this the one that will get Congress to do whatever, or will get the governor to do whatever? And I tell those people whose hearts are in the right, I don't care. What I want to know is this the time when you will do something as an individual? Amy's mentioned some specifics. There are all kinds of ways to get involved in the community, but the broader point is each of us needs to look to the left, look to the right, look inside and say, yep, this is me. I'm going to do something myself. And I have one suggestion, and there are many, and people will remember the phrase. It's if you see something, say something. 80% or so of people who commit mass shootings make their intentions known, whether to family and friends or via social media, because they start talking about what they're going to do. It turned out we had advance. In retrospect, there was advance notice of the shooting that was going to go down in Sacramento, hours before the event. There's opportunity to intervene, even if it's only a matter of a few hours. But it's not just for mass shootings, it's also for suicides. People who are cycling into a suicidal act will often, in one way or another, ask for help. It might not look for a call for help, but that's what it is. And we can't turn away from one another at times like that.
I think that's really great advice. Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I want to thank you both so much for taking the time to share your findings and your work. You're really doing really important work that will benefit all of us.
A pleasure.
Thanks for having us.
Garen Wintemute is a practicing emergency medicine physician and director of the UC Davis Violence Prevention Research Program, and Amy Barnhorst is the vice chair for community mental health at the UC Davis Department of Psychiatry and director of the Bullet Points Project. On the next UC Davis Live, we'll be talking about autism acceptance and advances with researchers and advocates. That's coming up Thursday, April 28th at 2 p.m. Pacific. I'm Satirius Johnson, and this is UC Davis Live.